Ramesh Kumar stood outside the tall iron gates of St. Xavier's College, clutching a crumpled appointment letter in his sweaty palms. At 45 years old, this wasn't where he imagined he'd be. Just 6 months ago, he owned a small tea shop in the crowded lanes of the old city. It wasn't much, but it was his. Then the medical bills came when his wife fell sick, followed by the loan shark's threats, and before he knew it, everything was gone. Now here he was, about to start work as a peon. A servant, really. Someone who would serve tea to professors, clean blackboards, and run errands. His neighbors had given him pitying looks when they heard. His own brother had laughed bitterly and said, "All those years of dreaming, and this is where you end up." But Ramesh needed this job. His wife was recovering, his daughter was in 10th grade, and his son needed books for school. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. The first week was harder than he expected, not because of the work itself, but because of the invisibility. Students rushed past him in the corridors without a glance. Professors handed him their empty teacups without looking at his face. He was just part of the furniture, something that existed to make their lives easier. He swept floors, carried files from one department to another, and made countless cups of tea. The college was huge, with old stone buildings and high ceilings that made every footstep echo. Sometimes, while cleaning a classroom after hours, Ramesh would stop and look at the equations still written on the blackboard, the diagrams explaining scientific concepts, the English grammar rules carefully outlined in colored chalk. His own education had ended when he was 13. His father, a daily wage laborer, had pulled him out of school after 8th grade. "We need you to work," his father had said, and that was that. But Ramesh had always loved learning. He remembered staying up late with borrowed textbooks, trying to teach himself things his teachers never got to cover. That hunger never really went away. It just got buried under years of struggling to survive, to feed his family, to keep his tea shop running. Now in these quiet classrooms it stirred again. One evening, while cleaning the physics lab, Ramesh found a textbook left behind on a bench. He picked it up, intending to put it in the lost and found box. But the chapter title caught his eye: Laws of Motion. He remembered learning about Newton in school, how excited he'd felt understanding that everything in the universe followed rules you could learn and predict. He sat down, just for a moment, and started reading. The words came back to him easier than he expected. He'd always had a good memory. Before he knew it, an hour had passed and the security guard was calling his name, asking if he was done for the day. After that, Ramesh started staying late whenever he could. He'd finish his work quickly and efficiently, then spend time reading whatever textbooks students left behind. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, English literature. He discovered that senior students often threw away their notes in old textbooks, considering them useless once exams were over. Ramesh collected these, taking them home to read at night after his family slept. His wife Meena noticed the change in him. "You seem happier these days," she said one night. Despite everything, he couldn't quite explain it to her. How could he tell her that being surrounded by learning, even from the shadows, made him feel alive in a way his tea shop never had? The college had a rhythm, Ramesh quickly learned. Morning rush of students, mid-morning lectures, lunch break chaos, afternoon classes, evening activities, then the slow emptying of corridors. He learned which professors were kind, which ones were harsh. He noticed which students struggled, which ones sailed through easily. There was one girl he saw often sitting alone in the library corner during lunch breaks, her face buried in mathematics textbooks. Priya Sharma. He learned her name from hearing other students call her. She always looked worried, her forehead creased in concentration, sometimes with tears of frustration in her eyes. One Tuesday afternoon, Ramesh was cleaning the third-floor classrooms when he heard someone crying. He followed the sound to classroom 304. Through the small window in the door, he saw Priya sitting at a desk, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Test papers were scattered around her, covered in red marks and corrections. Ramesh hesitated. It wasn't his place to interfere. He was just the peon, but something about her despair reminded him of his own daughter, who also struggled with mathematics, who also came home sometimes with tears in her eyes. He knocked gently on the door. Priya looked up, quickly wiping her eyes, embarrassed to be caught crying. "Yes?" she said, her voice rough. "Sorry to disturb," Ramesh said quietly. "I was just checking if the room was empty for cleaning." He could see the mathematics paper on her desk, covered in algebraic equations. The red mark showed she'd gotten most of them wrong. "I'm leaving," Priya said, starting to gather her papers. But her hands were shaking and the papers slipped, falling to the floor. Ramesh instinctively bent to help her pick them up. As he did, he glanced at the problems. Quadratic equations. He remembered those. They'd fascinated him once, the way you could solve for unknown values using fixed rules. "These are tricky," he said without thinking, picking up one of the sheets. "But there's a pattern to them, like a puzzle." Priya looked at him surprised. "You know mathematics?" Ramesh suddenly felt awkward. What was he doing? Talking to a student like this? He was just the peon. But something in her desperate, hopeful eyes made him continue. "A little," he admitted. "I studied till 8th grade. But I always loved numbers." He paused, then pointed to one of her equations. "This one here, you're getting confused because you're trying to solve it all at once. But if you break it into smaller steps, like climbing stairs one at a time, it becomes easier." For the next 10 minutes, standing there in that empty classroom with a mop bucket beside him, Ramesh explained quadratic equations using the simplest words he could find. He compared them to his own life, to balancing his household budget, to figuring out how much tea he needed to make at his old shop based on different numbers of customers. When he finished, Priya was staring at him with wide eyes. "That made more sense than 3 weeks of classes," she whispered. The next morning, Ramesh arrived at college wondering if he'd made a mistake. Who was he to teach anyone? He was just a peon with an 8th grade education. Priya probably went home and realized he'd confused her even more. Or worse, maybe she'd complained to someone about the peon bothering her. But during lunch break, while he was serving tea in the staff room, he heard a soft knock on the door. It was Priya. She looked around nervously, saw him, and gestured for him to come outside. "I tried the method you showed me," she said quickly, keeping her voice low. "I solved 10 more problems last night. They all worked out correctly. My brother checked them, and he's an engineering student." Her eyes were bright with excitement.
"Can you explain the next chapter to me, please?"
"I have a test next week." Ramesh looked around nervously. "I'm working," he said. "And I don't think it's appropriate for me to—" "Please," Priya interrupted. "My tuition teacher explains things in such complicated ways. My professor goes too fast, but you made it so simple. Just 15 minutes during lunch break? I'll bring my book." Something in Ramesh couldn't say no to that eagerness. He remembered feeling exactly that way as a child. Desperate to understand, desperate to learn. "Okay," he agreed. "But not here. The garden behind the library, and just for a few minutes." That afternoon, sitting on a stone bench under a large neem tree, Ramesh explained polynomials to Priya using mangoes and apples as examples. If you have some number of mangoes you don't know, that's your variable. If you perform operations on them, that's your equation. Solve it step by step like following a recipe. Priya understood. More than that, she was excited about understanding. For Ramesh, watching her face light up with comprehension was better than any salary. The next day, Priya came back with a friend. "This is Amit," she said. "He's also struggling with mathematics."
"Can you help him too?"
By the end of the week, there were 5 students sitting around Ramesh during lunch break in the garden. Word had spread quietly among those who were falling behind, those who found the regular classroom teaching too fast or too complicated. Ramesh was terrified and thrilled at the same time. These were college students, and he was explaining concepts he'd taught himself from their discarded textbooks. But somehow his simple explanations worked. Maybe because he'd struggled to understand these things himself, he knew exactly where the confusion lay. He started preparing. Every night after his family slept, he'd sit with the textbooks he'd collected and study the chapters his students were learning. He'd think about how to explain them in the simplest way possible, using examples from everyday life that anyone could understand. Physics became cricket. When explaining velocity and acceleration, he'd talk about how fast a cricket ball travels when bowled versus when it's hit for a 6. Force and motion, that was like pushing his old tea cart through crowded streets. How harder pushes made it move faster. How heavy loads made it harder to push. Chemistry turned into cooking.
"He needs to stop immediately," Dr. Sharma said with finality.
"I'll speak to him today. And I'm disappointed that you didn't report this sooner instead of condoning it by watching." But Professor Mehta wasn't ready to give up. "Sir, at least observe one session before you decide. See for yourself what's happening. If you still want him to stop after that, I'll support your decision." Dr. Sharma hesitated. These students should be in remedial classes with qualified teachers. They were, Professor Maida said. And they were still failing. Now they're passing. Doesn't that count for something? After much persuasion, Dr. Sharma reluctantly agreed to observe one session, though he made it clear his mind was already made up. The next day, Dr. Sharma and Professor Maida stood at a distance from the garden during lunch break. About 40 students were gathered around Ramesh now. The peon who'd been terrified days ago had regained his confidence, explaining Newton's laws of motion using the example of a bicycle. When you pedal harder, you accelerate faster, Ramesh was saying. When you brake, friction slows you down. When you turn, you feel pushed outward because of inertia. Every bicycle ride is physics in action. These aren't just formulas to memorize, they're explanations for what you experience every single day. Dr. Sharma watched with a frown, but Professor Maida noticed something. The principal didn't interrupt. He kept watching, and as the session continued, his frown gradually softened into something that looked almost like curiosity. When the session ended, Dr. Sharma called an emergency staff meeting for that afternoon. All teaching faculty were required to attend. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. Rumors had already spread that something unusual was happening. Dr. Sharma stood at the head of the table and explained the situation. The reactions were immediate and divided. Some professors were outraged, calling it an insult to their profession. Others were intrigued, asking questions about the students' improvement. A few were defensive, suggesting that if students couldn't learn from qualified teachers, that was the students' problem, not theirs. This sets a dangerous precedent, Professor Dixit from the mathematics department argued. If we allow a peon to teach, what message does that send about the value of education and qualifications? The message it sends, Professor Maida countered, is that we care about student learning more than we care about egos and hierarchy. That's easy for you to say, Professor Dixit shot back. You're not the one being made to look incompetent. The argument grew heated. Some faculty members defended traditional standards. Others pointed out that clearly something wasn't working if so many students were seeking help outside regular classes. A few suggested that maybe they could learn something from Ramesh's teaching methods instead of shutting him down. Dr. Sharma let the debate continue for almost an hour before holding up his hand for silence. Here's what troubles me most, he said slowly. We have 40 students so desperate for help that they're willing to learn from a peon during their lunch break, rather than attend our official remedial sessions. That says something about us, doesn't it? The room went quiet. Nobody wanted to admit that he was right. However, Dr. Sharma continued, we cannot simply ignore protocols and qualifications. We are an institution with standards to maintain. He paused, looking around at the assembled faculty. So here is my proposal. Everyone leaned forward, curious. We conduct a 1-month trial period. Ramesh will be permitted to hold official after-school tutoring sessions for students who are struggling across multiple subjects. He will be monitored by Professor Maida. If there are any complaints from students or parents, or if academic results don't show measurable improvement, the experiment ends immediately. If it succeeds, we'll reassess the situation. Professor Dixit looked appalled. You're actually going to allow this? I'm going to allow our students to get the help they clearly need, Dr. Sharma said firmly. That's what we're here for, isn't it? Education? Or have we forgotten that somewhere along the way? The vote was close, but the proposal passed. Ramesh would get his chance. When Professor Mehta went to tell him the news, she found him in the basement storage room, sitting among old furniture and boxes, his head in his hands. He looked up with red-rimmed eyes. They're going to fire me, aren't they? He asked quietly. I've ruined everything. My family depends on this job, and I've thrown it away because I couldn't mind my own business. Actually, Professor Mehta said with a smile, you're being promoted. Temporarily, at least. They want you to teach. Ramesh couldn't sleep the night before his first official tutoring session. His wife Meena found him sitting at their small kitchen table at 3 a.m, surrounded by textbooks and handwritten notes, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to organize his thoughts. You need rest? She said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. What if I fail? Ramesh whispered. What if I was just lucky with those students in the garden? What if now that it's official, with everyone watching, I can't do it? They'll fire me for sure, and then what will we do? Meena sat down beside him. You've been teaching those students for weeks. Nothing has changed except the location and the permission. You're still the same person who helped them understand what their professors couldn't. But Ramesh knew everything had changed. Before it was informal, friendly, just him helping students who asked for it. Now it was official. He was representing the college. Professor Mehta would be watching him. The principal had made it clear this was a trial, that one mistake could end everything. The pressure felt crushing. The next evening, Ramesh entered classroom 203 with his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. He'd been given permission to use the room for 2 hours after regular classes ended. Professor Mehta sat in the back, a notebook in her lap, ready to observe and evaluate. 15 students were waiting. Some were from his garden sessions, including Priya and Amit. Others were new faces, students who'd heard about him and wanted to see if the rumors were true. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. After all, he was still wearing his Peon's uniform, though he'd washed and ironed it carefully that morning. Ramesh's mind went blank. All his preparation, all his notes, everything vanished. He stood in front of the blackboard, chalk in his trembling hand, unable to remember what he'd planned to teach. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Students shifted in their seats. Professor Mehta looked concerned. This was exactly what Ramesh had feared, that when the moment came he'd freeze and prove everyone right who said a peon had no business teaching. Then Priya raised her hand. "Sir, can you help me with thermodynamics? I have a test next week and I'm completely lost." The word sir broke through Ramesh's panic. These students were calling him sir, not treating him like a servant but like a teacher. He took a deep breath and remembered why he was here, not to prove anything to the administration or to himself, but to help students who needed him. "Thermodynamics," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Let's start with something you all understand. Has anyone here cooked rice?" The confused looks on the students' faces made him smile, which helped him relax. For the next 90 minutes, Ramesh taught thermodynamics through cooking rice, explained entropy through a messy room getting messier, discussed energy transfer through hot tea cooling down. He moved around the classroom, drawing diagrams, asking questions, making sure everyone followed along. When the session ended, Professor Mehta approached him with an unreadable expression. Ramesh braced himself for criticism. "You started nervous," she said, "but once you found your rhythm, you were excellent. Same technique as in the garden, making complex things relatable." "Well done," relief flooded through Ramesh. "Thank you, Professor. Don't thank me yet," she warned. "This is just day one. You'll need to maintain this quality consistently." Word spread quickly. By the third session, attendance had doubled to 30 students. By the end of the first week, Ramesh was teaching 45 students across 3 different subject areas: mathematics, basic sciences, and English. He had to split them into 2 groups, running sessions back to back, teaching until his throat was hoarse. His routine became exhausting. Wake up at 5, prepare for the day's sessions, reach college by 7 to complete his peon duties, teach during lunch in the garden for students who couldn't attend evening sessions, finish afternoon duties, then teach 2 hours in the evening. He'd reach home by 8, eat a quick dinner, then study until midnight to prepare for the next day. "You're going to collapse," Meena warned after 2 weeks. "You barely sleep. You're not eating properly." This is too much, but Ramesh couldn't stop. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. A student who'd been failing mathematics for 2 semesters solved a complex problem correctly and literally jumped with joy. Another student who'd hated chemistry told Ramesh it had become her favorite subject. Parents started sending thank you notes to the college, praising the improvement in their children's grades and attitudes toward learning. Not everyone was happy, though. Some students who'd been doing well in regular classes felt insulted by the suggestion they attend a peon's tutoring. Some parents questioned why their children needed extra help from someone without proper qualifications, and several professors felt their authority undermined. Professor Dixit from mathematics was particularly vocal. During a staff meeting, he stood up and said, "My students are attending this peon sessions instead of coming to my office hours. It's humiliating. They're basically saying I can't teach as well as someone with an 8th grade education. Maybe we should ask why that is," Professor Mehta suggested quietly. "What is he doing that we're not?" "He's entertainment," Professor Dixit snapped. "Making everything into games and stories. Real mathematics requires rigor and discipline, not cricket analogies." Dr. Sharma, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke. The semester exam results will tell us what we need to know. If students' grades improve significantly, then perhaps we should learn from his methods instead of resenting them. 3 weeks into the trial, a local journalist visited the college to write a feature about a new science lab. While wandering the campus, she heard about the unusual tutoring sessions and became curious. She attended one evening session and was fascinated by what she witnessed. The article appeared in the Sunday newspaper under the headline, "The Peon Who Teaches: Breaking Barriers in Indian Education." It described Ramesh's journey, from tea shop owner to college peon to unofficial teacher. It quoted students who said he'd changed their lives. It included quotes from Dr. Sharma about the trial program and from Professor Mehta about innovative teaching methods. By Monday morning, the story had spread across social media. News channels picked it up. Suddenly, Ramesh found himself in the middle of a media storm he never wanted or expected. Reporters showed up at the college gates wanting interviews. Social media erupted with debates. Education reformers praised Ramesh as proof that good teaching came from passion and connection, not just degrees and certificates. Critics argued that lowering standards would damage the education system. Political commentators on television used his story to push various agendas about education reform, though most had never met Ramesh or understood what he actually did. The attention terrified Ramesh. "I just want to teach," he told Meena one evening after refusing 3 interview requests. "I don't want to be famous. I don't want to be anyone's symbol or political tool." But the attention brought both benefits and problems. More students wanted to attend his sessions, far more than he could accommodate. Parents from other schools called asking if their children could join. Educational organizations invited him to speak at conferences, which he declined because the very thought of public speaking to adults made him nauseous. The pressure also increased on Dr. Sharma. The college's board of trustees held an emergency meeting, worried about the institution's image. Conservative members argued that allowing a peon to teach sent the wrong message about academic standards. Progressive members saw it as innovative and publicity-worthy. The debate became heated. Meanwhile, Ramesh continued teaching. He ignored the media circus as much as possible and focused on his students. But he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. He wasn't just teaching anymore, he was being watched, judged, analyzed. Every session felt like an audition, like he was constantly proving he deserved to be there. Then came a challenge he didn't expect. A parent complained that Ramesh's teaching was too simplistic, that students were learning shortcuts instead of proper methodology. The parent, a professor at another college, demanded her son stop attending the sessions and filed a formal complaint with the administration. Dr. Sharma called Ramesh to his office. "This is what we were worried about," the principal said, looking tired. "One complaint could end the entire program. The parent is threatening to go to the media, claiming we're compromising educational quality." "I can speak to her," Ramesh offered. "Explain my methods." "She doesn't want to speak to you," Dr. Sharma interrupted gently. "She wants the program shut down. She says her son is learning to rely on tricks instead of understanding fundamental concepts." Professor Mehta, who was also present, spoke up. "But the students' grades have improved significantly. Isn't that what matters?" "Not if the foundation is weak," Dr. Sharma said. "We need to be sure that students aren't just memorizing Ramesh's simplified explanations without truly understanding the underlying principles." It was decided that Ramesh's students would take a comprehensive test, designed by the faculty, covering all the topics he'd taught. The results would determine whether the program continued. If students performed well, proving they genuinely learned and understood, the trial would continue. If they struggled, it would end. Ramesh had 1 week to prepare his students for the most important test of his life. The night before the test, Ramesh couldn't eat dinner. He sat at his kitchen table staring at his hands, wondering if he'd failed his students. What if his simple methods had taught them wrong? What if they struggled with the test and their grades dropped because of him? These students had trusted him, and now their academic futures were being tested because of his involvement. "You've done your best," Meena said, sitting beside him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you gave those students hope and confidence. That's worth something." "Not if they fail," Ramesh said quietly. The next morning, 43 of Ramesh's students gathered in the examination hall. The test was comprehensive. covering mathematics, physics, chemistry, and English, all topics Ramesh had taught over the past month. The faculty had designed it carefully, including both straightforward problems and complex ones that required deep understanding, not just memorized shortcuts. Ramesh wasn't allowed in the examination hall. Instead, he waited outside, pacing nervously. Professor Mehta found him there 2 hours later, wearing a path in the corridor floor with his worried walking. "The test is still going on," she said. "You should go do your regular work. Worrying won't change anything." But Ramesh couldn't focus on serving tea or cleaning classrooms. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, came down to how those students performed in that room. More than that, their trust in him was being tested. They'd believed in him when no one else did, and he desperately didn't want to let them down. The results took 3 days to compile. Dr. Sharma wanted the faculty to grade them thoroughly, checking not just for right answers but for proper understanding and methodology. During those 3 days, Ramesh barely slept. He continued his duties mechanically, his mind constantly on the test results. On Friday afternoon, Dr. Sharma called a staff meeting. Ramesh was asked to attend, which had never happened before. He entered the meeting room feeling like he was walking to his own trial. Professor Mehta gave him an encouraging nod, but her face was unreadable. Dr. Sharma stood at the head of the table, holding a folder of papers. The room was silent, tense with anticipation. "I'll be direct," the principal began. "We've completed grading the comprehensive test taken by students attending Ramesh's tutoring sessions. The results are remarkable." He paused, and Ramesh's heart nearly stopped. "The average score was 78%, Dr. Sharma continued. "More significantly, when we compared these scores to the same students' previous test scores before they started attending tutoring, we found an average improvement of 23 percentage points. Some students improved by as much as 40%. Ramesh felt dizzy with relief. They'd passed. His students had passed. Furthermore, Dr. Sharma continued, looking around at the assembled faculty. When we examined their methodology and working, we found proper understanding, not shortcuts or tricks. They showed their steps clearly, explained their reasoning, and demonstrated genuine comprehension of concepts. Whatever teaching method Ramesh is using, it's working." Professor Dixit spoke up, his voice tight. "So we're just going to ignore that he has no formal qualifications? That he never went to college himself?" "I'm not ignoring anything," Dr. Sharma said firmly. "But I'm also not ignoring that 43 students who were struggling are now succeeding. As educators, isn't that our primary goal?" The room erupted in discussion. Some professors agreed that results spoke for themselves. Others remained concerned about setting precedents and maintaining standards. But the tone had shifted. It was no longer about whether Ramesh should be allowed to teach, but about how to officially integrate him into the college's educational structure. After 2 hours of debate, a decision was reached. Ramesh would be offered a new position, student mentor. It wasn't a teaching position officially, which would require formal qualifications, but it was a step above being a peon. His job would be to run after-school tutoring and study support sessions. His salary would increase modestly, and most significantly, the college would sponsor him to complete his education through a distance learning program. When Professor Mehta told Ramesh the news, he stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, to his embarrassment, tears started running down his face. "I'm 46 years old," he managed to say. "I never thought I'd go back to school." "You never stopped learning," Professor Mehta replied. "Now you'll just get the certificates to prove it." The news spread through the college like wildfire. Students who'd attended Ramesh's sessions celebrated. Many who hadn't begun showing interest in joining. But there was also resistance. Some students from privileged backgrounds made snide comments about the quality of education dropping. A few parents pulled their children from the college, claiming standards were being compromised. The media attention intensified. News channels ran debates about education reform, with Ramesh's story at the center. He became a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. Some saw him as proof that India's education system was broken and needed radical change. Others saw him as an exception that proved the importance of formal education. Ramesh tried to stay out of the public eye as much as possible. He gave one carefully prepared interview to a respectful journalist, explaining that he wasn't trying to replace traditional education or suggest that degrees didn't matter. He was simply trying to help students who needed support, using methods that made sense to him based on his own struggles to learn. "I'm not special," he said in the interview. "I just remember what it feels like to not understand something and desperately want to learn it. That's all I'm doing, helping others feel what I felt when something finally makes sense." The college, seeing the positive publicity despite some criticism, gave Ramesh a small office, actually just a converted storage room, but it had a desk, a chair, and shelves for books. It was his space. Students started calling it Ramesh Sir's office, and there was always a line of people waiting outside for help. His duties changed gradually. He still did some peon work. The college couldn't officially eliminate that position yet, but more of his time was dedicated to tutoring. He developed a structured schedule, different subjects on different days, beginner and advanced groups, one-on-one sessions for students with learning difficulties. Most significantly, he enrolled in a distance learning bachelor's program through a state university. At 46, he became a student again. His classmates were mostly young adults in their 20s, taking courses part-time while working. Ramesh was often the oldest in his online classes, but he was also often the most engaged. Studying while teaching was brutally difficult. He'd wake up at 4:30 in the morning to study before going to work. During lunch breaks, while other staff members relaxed, he'd review course materials. At night, after teaching his evening sessions and returning home, he'd study until midnight or later. His daughter, Nisha, now in her final year of school, would sometimes join him at the kitchen table, both of them doing homework together. "Papa, you're studying harder than I am," she'd joke. "I have more to catch up on," Ramesh would reply. But the truth was, he loved it. Every concept he learned, every exam he passed felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that had been lost when he was forced to leave school at 13. The first semester was agonizing. His writing skills were rusty, his exam technique needed work, and he struggled with time management. But he passed all his courses. Barely, but he passed. By the second semester, he'd found his rhythm. His grades improved. He discovered that his years of teaching himself had actually given him strong study skills. He knew how to break down complex topics, find the core concepts, build understanding step by step. Meanwhile, his reputation at the college grew. More students sought his help. Not just struggling students anymore, but even good students who wanted to understand concepts more deeply. His teaching methods, once viewed as simplistic shortcuts, were now being discussed seriously by the education department. Professor Mehta attended several of his sessions to document his techniques. She wrote a paper about his teaching methods, submitting it to an education journal. "You're using principles of constructivist learning theory," she explained to Ramesh one day. "Building new understanding on existing knowledge, using real-world connections to make abstract concepts concrete. These are established pedagogical principles, you're just applying them intuitively." "I don't know about theories," Ramesh admitted. "I just teach the way I wish someone had taught me." "That's precisely what makes you effective," Professor Mehta said. "You remember what it feels like to struggle, so you meet students where they are." 2 years passed. Ramesh continued teaching, studying, balancing multiple responsibilities. His wife worried about his health. He'd lost weight and looked constantly tired. But she also saw how alive he seemed. This wasn't just work for him, it was purpose. His son started college inspired by his father's journey. His daughter scored well in her board exams and got admission to a good university. "Papa, I want to be a teacher," she told him. "Like you." "Then get proper qualifications first," Ramesh advised with a smile. "Don't take the long route like your father did." In his third year of the distance learning program, Ramesh took advanced courses in education theory and psychology. He was fascinated by learning about teaching methodologies formally, discovering that many techniques he'd developed instinctively had names and research supporting them. He started experimenting with new approaches in his tutoring sessions. He introduced peer teaching, where stronger students helped weaker ones, discovering that teaching others reinforced understanding. He created study groups that continued meeting even without his presence, building learning communities. He developed simple visual aids and teaching tools from inexpensive materials. The college's academic performance began improving overall. More students were passing difficult courses. Fewer were dropping out due to academic struggles. The administration noticed, And while they couldn't directly attribute all improvement to Ramesh's mentoring, the correlation was clear. Professor Dixit, who'd been one of Ramesh's strongest critics, grudgingly admitted during a staff meeting, "Whatever he's doing, it's working. My failure rates have dropped by 30% since students started attending his sessions. Maybe it's time we learned from him instead of just tolerating him," Professor Mehta suggested. This led to an unexpected development. The college organized a voluntary workshop where Ramesh shared his teaching techniques with interested faculty members. The idea was terrifying to him. Teaching teachers how to teach felt presumptuous. But Professor Mehta encouraged him. "You're not telling them they're wrong," she explained. "You're just sharing what works for you. They can take what's useful and adapt it." The workshop was attended by about 15 professors, some genuinely curious, others skeptical but willing to listen. Ramesh was so nervous his hands shook as he presented examples of how he explained concepts. He expected criticism, arguments, dismissal. Instead, several professors started asking thoughtful questions. How did he decide which real-world examples to use? How did he assess whether students truly understood or just memorized? How did he build confidence in students who'd failed multiple times? The most surprising moment came when Professor Dixit raised his hand and said, "I've been teaching mathematics for 20 years. I never thought about connecting it to cricket or cooking or budgets. I just taught it the way I was taught. Abstractly, theoretically. Maybe that's why so many students struggle." After the workshop, 3 professors asked Ramesh if they could observe his tutoring sessions to learn more. He agreed, feeling surreal about the whole situation. Just 3 years ago, these same people wouldn't have looked at him twice. Now they were seeking his advice. The final semester of Ramesh's bachelor's program was the hardest. He had to complete a major project while managing his teaching responsibilities and family needs. He chose to write about alternative teaching methods for science education, drawing from his own experience. He interviewed his students about what helped them learn. He documented his techniques with videos and photographs. He analyzed success rates and collected feedback. The project consumed him for 4 months, but when he submitted it, he felt proud. It wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a record of everything he'd learned and developed. The day his final exam results were posted online, Ramesh was in the middle of a tutoring session. Professor Mehta burst into the room, her phone in her hand and a huge smile on her face. "You passed," she announced. "You didn't just pass, Ramesh. You got a first division. You're officially a college graduate." The room exploded in cheers. Students jumped up, clapping and celebrating. Some were crying. For many of them, Ramesh's success felt like their own, proof that it was never too late, that circumstances didn't have to define your future. Ramesh stood there, overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face. He was 49 years old. It had taken him 36 years to get the degree he should have earned at 22. But he'd done it. The college organized a special ceremony for Ramesh's graduation. It wasn't official. The actual university convocation would come later. But the college wanted to celebrate. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, staff, and local media. Dr. Sharma gave a speech about how Ramesh's journey reminded them all why they were in education, not just to deliver information, but to transform lives. Professor Mehta spoke about the teaching methods Ramesh had pioneered at their college. Methods now being discussed in education journals. When it was Ramesh's turn to speak, he stood at the podium in the same hall where he'd once swept floors and looked out at hundreds of faces. His wife and children sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "I'm not a hero," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm just someone who was lucky enough to find a second chance. If my story teaches anything, it's that learning doesn't have an age limit, and teaching doesn't require a certificate, it requires care." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I lost my tea shop and became a peon here, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd failed at everything. But this college, these students, they showed me I still had something to offer. They taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." The applause was deafening. Students who'd never even attended his sessions were on their feet, cheering. Even some professors who'd opposed him initially were clapping. After the ceremony, Ramesh was surrounded by well-wishers. Local newspapers took photographs. Education organizations offered him speaking opportunities, which he continued to mostly decline. He wasn't comfortable with fame or attention. He just wanted to teach. The college made his position permanent. He was no longer officially a peon. Now he was a full-time student mentor and academic support coordinator, a position created specifically for him. His salary increased significantly, not to what professors made, but enough that his family could live comfortably. More importantly, the college established the Ramesh Kumar Fellowship Program, offering staff members from any background the opportunity to pursue higher education with the college's support. 2 janitorial staff, a security guard, and a canteen worker enrolled in various distance learning programs that year. Ramesh continued teaching, but now he also mentored these staff members, helping them balance work and study just as he had. He understood their struggles because he'd lived them. He enrolled in a master's program in education. At 50, he was becoming a serious education scholar, publishing papers about accessible teaching methods and conducting workshops at other institutions. He never lost the humility that made him effective. He still remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to struggle. 5 years after that first terrified tutoring session, Ramesh received a national award for innovative teaching. The ceremony was in Delhi, at the National Education Summit. He traveled there with his wife and children his first time in the capital city. When he accepted the award, standing on stage in front of education ministers and renowned academics, he felt like he was living someone else's life. How had the tea shop owner who became a peon ended up here? But he knew the answer. It wasn't about him being special or talented. It was about getting a chance, taking it despite fear, and having people who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. In his acceptance speech, Ramesh said, "This award isn't just mine. It belongs to every student who trusted me when I was just a peon. It belongs to Professor Mehta, who saw potential instead of just a problem. It belongs to Dr. Sharma, who took a risk on an unconventional solution. And it belongs to everyone who's ever been told they're not qualified, not smart enough, not good enough, but kept trying anyway." Today, at 53, Ramesh teaches full-time at St. Xavier's College. He's completed his master's degree and is considering starting a PhD. His teaching methods are studied in education courses. He's written a book about accessible pedagogy that's used in teacher training programs. But what makes him happiest isn't the recognition or the awards. It's the moments in his office when a struggling student finally understands a concept, when their face lights up with that beautiful aha moment. It's receiving messages from former students who've graduated and found jobs, who write to thank him for believing in them. It's knowing that somewhere right now, there might be another person like he was, someone written off and overlooked, who just needs a chance to discover what they're capable of. And maybe, just maybe, his story will give them hope that it's never too late, that circumstances aren't destiny, that a peon can become a mentor, that the invisible can become invaluable. Every morning when Ramesh enters the college gates, he still remembers his first day there, clutching his appointment letter, feeling like a failure. He remembers the invisibility, the dismissal, the despair. Then he looks at the sign on his office door, Ramesh Kumar, student mentor and academic coordinator, and he smiles. Life, he's learned, is full of unexpected chapters. Sometimes the endings we fear are actually beginnings in disguise. Sometimes losing everything teaches you what really matters, and sometimes the person you become is far more than you ever imagined you could be.